Michael Jackson's Neverland Ranch in Santa Barbara, California is up for sale for $100 million. The 2,700-acre property was bought by Jackson in 1987 for just under $20 million.
It sits behind locked gates in Santa Barbara County, California, stretching across nearly 2,700 acres of quiet, empty land that once hosted roller coasters, a private zoo, and a fantasy train station built for one of the most famous entertainers in history. On paper, it is a multi-million-dollar estate in a desirable rural region. In reality, Michael Jackson's Neverland Ranch feels more like the haunted amusement park from Silent Hill 3. So, why does no one want to buy Michael Jackson's abandoned Neverland Ranch? Well, today, we'll unveil the unfiltered truth. This is one roller coaster ride you just can't miss. Market struggle, cultural fallout, and legal pressure. By 2013, Neverland, now operating under its formal posthumous name, Sycamore Valley Ranch, had already drifted into an unusual kind of standstill. It was no longer the active, lived-in world Michael Jackson had built, but it also had not transitioned into anything new. The rides were gone, the animals removed, and the gates largely closed. What remained was a vast, high-maintenance property tied to an increasingly complex legacy. Then, just as the estate seemed to be fading into quiet obscurity, a new legal wave pulled it sharply back into focus. That year, civil lawsuits were filed by Wade Robson and James Safechuck, both alleging that Michael Jackson had abused them during their childhood, including periods spent at Neverland Ranch. These claims referred to events said to have occurred decades earlier, but their timing was significant. Jackson had died in 2009, meaning the lawsuits were filed against his estate rather than the man himself. However, the cases immediately ran into procedural barriers. California law imposed strict statute of limitations rules on claims of this nature, and courts had to determine whether those limits could be extended based on when the plaintiffs said they had fully understood or processed the alleged abuse. Judges examined whether the lawsuits were legally viable given the long gap between the alleged incidents and the filing dates. Over several rulings, courts dismissed or restricted the claims, often citing timing issues rather than making determinations about the truth of the allegations themselves. Appeals followed, but the central legal obstacle remained: whether the cases could proceed at all, not whether they could be proven. While the legal system moved cautiously and narrowly, public attention began to build again. The estate, which had already struggled to detach itself from past controversy, was once more being named as a central setting in serious allegations. Troubles accelerated dramatically in 2019 with the release of the HBO documentary Leaving Neverland. The film presented detailed personal accounts from Robson and Safechuck, describing their alleged experiences with Jackson during their childhood years. Much of the narrative unfolded around Neverland itself, which was depicted not just as a backdrop, but as a central environment in their stories. The documentary did not introduce new forensic evidence or legal filings, but its impact came from its structure. Long-form, emotionally detailed testimony presented directly to a global audience. The reaction was immediate and widespread. Media outlets across multiple countries revisited Jackson's history. Radio stations in some regions temporarily removed his music from rotation, and public debate intensified across social and cultural lines. Fans, critics, and commentators split into sharply opposing camps, each interpreting the same material in fundamentally different ways. Neverland, once again, became the visual and symbolic center of that debate. Despite this surge in attention, the legal situation remained largely unchanged. No new criminal charges were filed, and no prior criminal cases were reopened. The constraints were clear. Jackson was deceased, and earlier investigations had already concluded without conviction. The civil cases continued to face procedural challenges, and while appeals kept them in the legal system, they did not immediately translate into courtroom trials or definitive rulings on the underlying claims. But for Neverland Ranch, all of this was bad press. The birth of Neverland. In 1988, when Michael Jackson stood at the absolute peak of global fame, he made a purchase that would quietly reshape both his life and his legacy. For about $17 million, he acquired Sycamore Valley Ranch in Santa Barbara County, California, a vast, rolling estate tucked into the rural landscape near Los Olivos. Jackson renamed it Neverland Ranch, directly referencing Peter Pan, the boy who refused to grow up. At that point in his life, Jackson had already spent more than 2 decades inside the machinery of fame, first as the child prodigy fronting the Jackson 5, then as the adult architect of Thriller, the best-selling album of all time. He had never experienced a conventional childhood, and Neverland was designed as a structural replacement for it, an engineered version of what he believed he had lost. The transformation began almost immediately after purchase. The ranch was reimagined from the ground up. Roads were reworked, landscapes reshaped, and functional agricultural land gradually gave way to theatrical design. Jackson introduced amusement rides uncommon for a private estate: a Ferris wheel, a carousel, bumper cars, and small roller coaster installations. A miniature railway was constructed, complete with its own station, allowing movement across the property in a way that felt more like a theme park than a residence. At the center of this transformation was a deliberate layering of emotional symbolism. Jackson installed a private zoo that housed exotic animals, including elephants, giraffes, tigers, and a chimpanzee named Bubbles, who would later become internationally recognizable. Sculptures of children playing were placed across the grounds, and floral arrangements were designed into shapes and patterns that reinforced a sense of innocence and playfulness. The entire estate began to resemble a controlled ecosystem of nostalgia. Inside the main residence, a fully equipped recording studio was installed, allowing Jackson to produce and refine music without leaving the property. Adjacent to it, a private movie theater with approximately 50 seats served both personal and professional purposes. This combination turned Neverland into more than a retreat. It became a working creative compound where music production, filmmaking, and private life merged without clear boundaries. Albums such as Dangerous were partially developed during this era, reinforcing the estate's role as a creative incubator rather than just a residence. By the early 1990s, Neverland had evolved into something few private estates had ever attempted: a hybrid between personal mythology and functional production space. Jackson lived there while simultaneously operating at the highest levels of global entertainment. The timing of Neverland's expansion also intersected with a shifting public image. As Jackson's fame expanded internationally, so did scrutiny of his private life. The estate, in this context, became both sanctuary and stage, an insulated world where he could dictate the terms of interaction, far removed from media intrusion in Los Angeles or other urban centers. Its rural isolation in Santa Barbara County was not incidental. It provided geographic distance from the entertainment industry's constant visibility. By this stage, the ranch was no longer just a residence, but a self-contained narrative environment. Visitors were often invited into a space that blurred reality and performance, where rides operated, animals roamed curated habitats, and every visual detail reinforced a constructed sense of childhood wonder. Yet behind the spectacle was a more complex motivation rooted in Jackson's personal history. Having grown up under intense professional pressure from an early age, he often described his childhood as incomplete. Neverland was, in effect, an architectural response to that absence, but it also became the setting for a major controversy in the life of the king of pop: the first legal crisis and rising suspicion. By 1993, Neverland Ranch had already become one of the most recognizable private estates in the world. But that year marked a sharp, irreversible turning point. The crisis began in August 1993, when a 13-year-old boy, Jordan Chandler, accused Michael Jackson of harassment and abuse. What started as a private complaint quickly escalated into a full-scale criminal investigation led by the Los Angeles Police Department and the Santa Barbara County Sheriff's Department, pulling one of the most famous figures on Earth into a legal storm that unfolded in real time under global media scrutiny. By late August 1993, Jackson's home, including Neverland, was searched by law enforcement. In December 1993, investigators went further, obtaining a warrant for a controversial body search of Jackson, attempting to compare physical descriptions provided by Chandler with Jackson's actual body. This detail became one of the most debated aspects of the case, with prosecutors later suggesting the descriptions were consistent, while Jackson's legal team strongly disputed that interpretation and questioned the credibility and handling of such evidence. From the prosecution's perspective, the case centered on a pattern of behavior. They argued that Jackson had cultivated close relationships with young boys, invited them into his private environment at Neverland, and used that setting to isolate and influence them. The estate itself became part of the narrative, not as direct evidence, but as context. Prosecutors implied that its design, privacy, and controlled access created opportunities for misconduct. However, it is crucial to note that in 1993, no formal criminal charges were ever filed, meaning the prosecution never presented a full case in court. The defense took a sharply different position, framing the entire situation as an attempted financial extortion. Jackson's legal team argued that the Chandler family had initially sought a large monetary payment before going public, and that the allegations were strategically escalated when negotiations failed. They emphasized inconsistencies in the timeline, questioned the motivations behind the claims, and maintained that there was no physical or forensic evidence proving criminal conduct. Publicly, Jackson denied all allegations and described the situation as a coordinated effort to exploit his wealth and global fame. So, was the case even strong enough to go to trial? Legally, prosecutors did consider pursuing criminal charges, and a grand jury was convened in 1994. However, the case faced a critical obstacle. Jordan Chandler declined to testify in a criminal proceeding. Without the cooperation of the alleged victim, the prosecution's ability to prove its case beyond a reasonable doubt was significantly weakened. In U.S. criminal law, especially in cases of this nature, the testimony of the accuser is often essential. Without it, the likelihood of securing a conviction drops sharply. At the same time, a parallel civil case was moving forward. Unlike criminal proceedings, civil cases require a lower burden of proof and can proceed independently. In January 1994, Jackson agreed to settle the civil lawsuit for a sum of around $20 million. The settlement ended the civil case but did not include any admission of guilt. Legally, settlements of this kind are not determinations of innocence or guilt. They are agreements to resolve disputes without trial. However, the timing of the settlement had a major impact on the criminal case. Once the civil matter was resolved, and with the accuser unwilling to testify, prosecutors ultimately decided not to file criminal charges. After the allegations, Jackson's public behavior changed. He reduced appearances, canceled parts of his dangerous tour, citing health issues, and entered rehabilitation for dependency on pain medication in late 1993. In the public sphere, the absence of a verdict did not translate into the absence of judgment. Instead, it created a vacuum filled by speculation, interpretation, and suspicion. Neverland Ranch, which had previously functioned as a symbol of curated innocence, became instantly entangled in that suspicion. As the case dominated headlines in 1993, Jackson's public image entered a period of sustained pressure. The settlement itself did not close the conversation. Instead, it intensified it. Legal analysts, entertainment journalists, and talk shows dissected every available detail, while speculation about what occurred behind the gates of Neverland spread globally. Even without a trial, the association between Jackson and the allegations became deeply embedded in public consciousness, and the estate remained permanently linked to that narrative. Despite the controversy, Jackson did not retreat from his career. But then came 2003, the second case and collapse of reputation. By 2003, Michael Jackson's life had already been living under a long shadow cast by the 1993 allegations. But what followed would escalate far beyond suspicion into a full criminal prosecution that placed Neverland Ranch at the center of a global legal spectacle. This time, the case moved directly into the criminal justice system of Santa Barbara County, California. The arrest came in November 2003, triggered by allegations involving Gavin Arvizo, a teenage boy who had appeared in a documentary featuring Jackson earlier that year. The documentary, Living with Michael Jackson, by journalist Martin Bashir, had reignited public debate about Jackson's relationships with children and his life inside Neverland. Following its broadcast, authorities opened an investigation that quickly escalated into formal charges. By 2004, Jackson was indicted on multiple felony counts. The legal framing of the case was severe, and the prosecution built its narrative around the idea that Neverland Ranch was not simply a residence, but a controlled environment allegedly used to isolate and influence minors. The estate's physical features, its gates, security systems, private bedrooms, and secluded layout, were repeatedly introduced in court arguments as contextual evidence. The 2005 trial became one of the most globally watched celebrity court cases of the modern era. Held in Santa Maria, California, under the jurisdiction of Santa Barbara County Superior Court, the proceedings lasted for several months and attracted constant international media coverage. Outside the courthouse, crowds of supporters and critics gathered daily, turning the trial into a public event as much as a legal one. Inside the courtroom, the prosecution presented testimony from witnesses and former associates attempting to establish a pattern of behavior tied to Jackson's interactions with minors and the environment at Neverland. The Arvizo family maintained that Gavin Arvizo had been abused during visits to Neverland Ranch. They also claimed that after the documentary aired and backlash against Jackson intensified, they were kept at the property against their will and pressured into cooperating with Jackson's team. The prosecution, led by District Attorney Thomas Sneddon, structured its case around a clear narrative that Jackson's relationship with the Arvizo family changed once public pressure mounted, shifting from hospitality to control. Prosecutors described Neverland as a highly controlled private space where children were allegedly given unrestricted access to the entertainer's personal quarters. They pointed to the estate's isolation as part of their broader argument about opportunity and access. The defense, however, pushed back strongly against this interpretation, arguing that Neverland was a cultural and recreational space built around fantasy and hospitality, not misconduct. Ron Zonin framed the case in stark terms, telling jurors it was about how a child was seduced and then held captive. The prosecution argued that before the documentary aired, the Arvizo family had been welcomed guests at Neverland. Afterward, however, they claimed the environment became restrictive. According to the state's theory, Jackson and his associates pressured the family to participate in a rebuttal video defending him against the negative publicity generated by the documentary. Prosecutors alleged that this was not voluntary support, but the result of intimidation and manipulation. Central to this argument was testimony from Gavin's mother, Janet Arvizo. She told the court that she felt trapped at Neverland and feared for her family's safety. She described a situation in which they believed they were being watched, claiming they were discouraged or outright prevented from leaving the property. Her testimony included descriptions of being transported under supervision and being told they needed to remain at the ranch. Prosecutors used her account to support the conspiracy charges, suggesting that Jackson's inner circle coordinated efforts to control the family's movements and public statements. Gavin Arvizo's testimony focused on specific allegations of misconduct. He claimed that Jackson had provided him alcohol, referred to as Jesus juice, and engaged in inappropriate behavior. His brother, Star Arvizo, also took the stand, reinforcing parts of the timeline and describing interactions at Neverland. Prosecutors emphasized consistency between the brothers' accounts and introduced footage from the rebuttal video the family recorded, arguing it demonstrated coercion rather than genuine support. To strengthen their position, the prosecution sought to introduce testimony from individuals connected to earlier allegations involving Jackson in the 1990s. This so-called prior bad acts evidence was intended to show a pattern of behavior rather than an isolated incident. The strategy was controversial and legally sensitive, as such evidence can influence a jury's perception beyond the specific charges being tried. Judge Rodney Melville allowed limited inclusion, meaning jurors were exposed to past allegations framed as potentially relevant to the current case. The defense, led by attorney Thomas Mesereau, took a direct and aggressive approach in response. From the outset, Mesereau challenged the credibility of the accusers, telling the jury that the case was built on deception and financial motive. He focused heavily on inconsistencies in the Arvizo family's accounts, presenting them as unreliable witnesses whose claims shifted over time. A major component of the defense strategy involved examining the family's history. Mesereau introduced evidence that Janet Arvizo had previously filed a lawsuit against J.C. Penney, alleging misconduct by store security, which resulted in a financial settlement reportedly exceeding $100,000. The defense argued that this demonstrated a pattern of legal action tied to monetary outcomes. During cross-examination, Mesereau confronted Janet with prior statements from that case, highlighting contradictions and pressing her on details related to timelines, movements, and interactions with Jackson's staff. These exchanges became some of the most intense moments in the trial. The defense worked to create doubt by exposing inconsistencies, suggesting that if the jury questioned the family's credibility, the entire case would weaken. Supporting this approach, the defense called former Neverland employees who testified that the Arvizo family was not confined and had freedom of movement. Travel records and photographs were presented to show that the family had left the ranch multiple times during the period they claimed to be held. Mesereau used this evidence to challenge the core of the prosecution's conspiracy argument. In closing, he argued that the idea of imprisonment did not align with the documented movements of the family. He also questioned the logic of the timeline, pointing out that the family publicly defended Jackson in the rebuttal video during the same period they later described as abusive. The defense argued that this behavior was inconsistent with coercion and that the prosecution had failed to prove otherwise with concrete evidence. Ultimately, the jury was left with two sharply conflicting narratives. The prosecution presented a story of manipulation, control, and exploitation within the isolated environment of Neverland. The defense countered with a narrative of fabrication, financial motive, and unreliable testimony. The inclusion of past allegations added weight to the prosecution's claims, but the defense's focus on credibility introduced significant doubt. In June 2005, that doubt proved decisive. Jackson was acquitted on all counts, but the outcome in court did not erase the consequences outside it. His legal victory came at a massive financial cost. Financial collapse and loss of control. By 2005, the legal storm of the Santa Maria trial had ended in acquittal. By 2005, the legal storm of the Santa Maria trial had ended in acquittal, but the aftermath quietly triggered a second collapse. Michael Jackson left Neverland Ranch shortly after the trial and never returned as a resident. The gates that once defined a private universe of amusement rides, animals, and controlled fantasy were effectively closed. What had once been a highly personalized environment quickly became a logistical burden. Neverland was not designed to sit idle. The property spanned roughly 2,700 acres and included extensive infrastructure, including rail systems, themed buildings, landscaping, security installations, and specialized facilities that required constant maintenance. Without active use, operating costs did not decrease. They accumulated. Staff still needed to be retained, systems maintained, and grounds managed. Over time, the estate's upkeep reportedly ran into millions annually. This created a financial pressure that Jackson could no longer easily absorb. By the late 2000s, Jackson's financial situation had become increasingly strained. Despite his global fame and continued cultural influence, liquidity issues mounted behind the scenes. In 2008, this pressure crystallized into a decisive financial event. He defaulted on a loan of approximately $24.5 million, which had been secured against Neverland Ranch itself. The default placed the property at risk of foreclosure, meaning it could have been seized and sold by lenders if the debt remained unresolved. At this point, Colony Capital, a real estate investment firm led by billionaire financier Thomas Barrack Jr., stepped into the situation. Rather than allow a public foreclosure, the firm purchased the debt tied to Neverland. This move fundamentally altered the ownership dynamics of the estate. While Jackson retained nominal association with the property, control over its financial and operational future shifted into corporate hands. This intervention marked a turning point. Neverland was no longer functioning as a private estate under the direct control of its creator. Instead, it became an asset managed through financial structuring and investment strategy. Colony Capital's involvement was framed publicly as a stabilizing measure, but in practice, it meant the estate was now treated as collateralized real estate rather than a personal sanctuary. The emotional and symbolic connection between Jackson and the property began to weaken as legal and financial mechanisms took precedence. During this period, Jackson himself was largely absent from Neverland. He spent time in various locations, including rented properties in the United States and abroad, while continuing to work intermittently on music projects. The estate that once defined his public imagination was no longer part of his daily life, and its role in his personal identity diminished significantly after years of legal and financial strain. In June 2009, the situation reached a final and irreversible turning point. On June 25, 2009, Michael Jackson died at the age of 50 in Los Angeles after suffering cardiac arrest at his rented home in Holmby Hills. Emergency responders arrived shortly after a 911 call was placed from the residence, and he was transported to Ronald Reagan UCLA Medical Center, where he was pronounced dead. The cause was later determined to be acute intoxication from the anesthetic propofol combined with benzodiazepines, medications typically used for anxiety and sedation. Propofol, in particular, is not intended for home use and is normally administered in hospital settings under strict monitoring due to its powerful effects on breathing and heart function. The investigation quickly focused on Jackson's personal physician, Conrad Murray, who had been administering propofol as a sleep aid in the weeks leading up to Jackson's death while he was preparing for his planned This Is It concert series in London. According to court findings, Murray gave Jackson repeated doses of the substances without proper medical equipment, monitoring, or emergency preparedness. In 2011, Murray was convicted of involuntary manslaughter in Los Angeles Superior Court and sentenced to 4 years in prison, though he served about 2 years before being released. The death was officially ruled a homicide by the Los Angeles County coroner, not in the sense of intent, but due to gross medical negligence. Jackson's passing triggered global mourning, with millions of fans reacting worldwide, and it permanently froze every unresolved aspect of his life. Neverland also underwent a formal rebranding. It was renamed Sycamore Valley Ranch, a deliberate move that distanced the property from its highly charged cultural identity. The amusement structures and thematic elements associated with Jackson's vision were no longer operational, and the estate's identity was reframed in strictly financial and legal terms. Under this new structure, the property was managed as part of Jackson's broader estate holdings rather than as an active residence or creative space. Decisions regarding its future were handled by financial managers and investment partners, with attention focused on debt recovery, asset valuation, and long-term market positioning. But you see, despite the rebranding, the ranch would continue to repel buyers. Final sale and aftermath. In 2015, the estate was placed back on the market with a listed price of approximately $100 million. The valuation reflected not just land value, but also the Jackson brand, historical significance, and the sheer scale of the property. However, this number immediately drew skepticism from real estate professionals familiar with the region and asset type. Sycamore Valley Ranch was located in a rural area of Santa Barbara County near Los Olivos, a region known more for vineyards and agricultural estates than high-profile celebrity compounds. Analysts noted that its geographic isolation limited its pool of potential luxury buyers. Unlike properties in Beverly Hills, Malibu, or other high-density luxury markets, Neverland required a very specific type of buyer willing to manage both distance and operational complexity. Beyond location, the estate carried significant structural and financial challenges. The amusement infrastructure that once defined it had been dismantled or rendered non-operational. What remained was a vast rural property with specialized layouts and high maintenance demands. Industry estimates often cited ongoing upkeep costs in the hundreds of thousands of dollars annually, even without active use or restoration of former attractions. By 2017, the asking price was reduced to approximately $67 million. Despite the reduction, there were still no confirmed buyers. Interest was reported intermittently, but no transaction reached completion. 2 years later, the price dropped again, this time to around $31 million, less than one-third of its original listing. The reduction reflected mounting pressure to resolve the asset rather than hold it indefinitely. Even at this significantly lower price, the estate remained unsold. Then, in December 2020, after more than a decade of price cuts, failed negotiations, and cultural controversy, Neverland Ranch finally changed hands. The buyer was Ron Burkle, a billionaire investor and co-founder of Yucaipa Companies, known for large-scale investments in retail and private equity, rather than celebrity estates or heritage properties. The reported purchase price was approximately $22 million, a dramatic drop from the $100 million listing that had been announced just 5 years earlier in 2015. By the time of the sale, the property was no longer functioning as the fantasy world it had once been. The amusement rides had long been removed, the private zoo dismantled, and the train station left as a silent architectural relic. What remained was a vast rural estate in Santa Barbara County, reclassified under its legal name, Sycamore Valley Ranch, and held primarily as undeveloped land with residual infrastructure from its past life. The transaction marked the end of its long marketing cycle rather than the beginning of a new public chapter. Burkle's acquisition was widely reported as a land banking investment, a strategy where high-net-worth investors purchase large parcels of land to hold long-term rather than immediately develop or occupy them. Public statements and reporting around the purchase emphasized that there were no announced plans for redevelopment, restoration of amusement features, or transformation into a public museum or memorial site. In practical terms, the estate remained exactly as it had been left, sealed, inactive, and structurally unchanged. Its association with past allegations and court cases ensured that it remained one of the most discussed celebrity properties in modern history. Ownership transfer did not reset its public identity. Well, that's it for now. Thanks for watching. Did you like this video? If you did, please consider liking, dropping a comment, and hitting the subscribe button so that you don't miss out on our new uploads. Also, don't miss this video you see on your screen right now. It's truly unbelievable.